pozdravljeni na drugem dnevu zborovanja Zveze zgodovinskih Zveze Slovenije. Veseli me, da lahko naše sredini pozdravim Marka Kulturna, kar je rezultat sodelovanja med Zvezo zgodovinskih društev Slovenije in znanstveno-raziskovalnim centrom slovenske akademije znanosti in umetnosti, ki se posebej rezultata angažmajo Petre Svoža. Mark Kulturna bo današnji vodni govornik s predavanjem The Spirit of 1914 Austria-Hungary. Profesor Mark Kulturna je profesor moderne evropske zgodovine in direktor dodiplomskega študija zgodovine na Fakulteti za humanistiko Univerze v Arhivom. Je eden vodilnih britanskih zgodovinarjev srednje evropske zgodovine 20. stoletja in avstro-ogrske zgodovine ter avtor in urednik številnih monografij. V svojih raziskavah se posebej posveča avstro-ogrski prve svetovne vojne, zgodovini čeških dežel, sudetskih Nemcev, nacionalizmu na Madžarskem, jugoslovanski ideji, zgodovini spolov in homoseksualnosti v srednjem in vzhodnem Evropi. Izdal je več monografij za delo v vplivu prve svetovne vojne na generacijo sudetskih Nemcev, na primeru življenjske zgodbe Heinza Ruta, je leta 2014 prijel nagrado Združenja za češko-slovaške raziskave, ki združuje tako evropske kot ameriške raziskovalce.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to your conference. It's a great privilege to be here, and thank you particularly to Petra Svoža for inviting me. I'm going to talk briefly about the spirit of 1914 in Austria-Hungary. And I apologize for speaking in English. 100 years ago, in October 1914, the spirit of 1914 had probably already disappeared across Austria-Hungary. This was true among civilians in Ljubljana or in Prague, or even in Vienna and Budapest, where there had perhaps been most enthusiasm for the war. But it was true too for many soldiers at the front, where the initial excitement about victory, the hope of glory, was quickly disappointed. The Habsburg armies did not quickly crush little Serbia, nor did they manage a quick victory over Russia in Galicia. Instead, the troops were retreating right back to Krakow in Galicia, while in the Balkans it was Serbia's army, of course, that was penetrating into Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now this suggests to us, I think, immediately, that the spirit of 1914, the enthusiasm that accompanied the outbreak of war, lasted only a few months. However, this time period, measured in days and weeks, was also relative because of what was experienced. Many civilians and soldiers felt in the summer of 1914 that they were living a whole lifetime of experiences. One officer wrote later that by late August he had drawn a line under his former life, for he was now entering a different world where events around him were constantly speeding up. The war, which started in an enthusiastic spirit, began in the space of 2 months to transform itself from life into death. Indeed, I think I would say that the spirit of 1914 disappeared as the phenomenon of mass death began to appear in towns and villages across the monarchy. Now, in this short talk, I want to explore this short period, this spirit of 1914. I think it helps us understand the different mindsets as the war started across Europe, but it introduces us also to the different loyalties which existed in the late Habsburg Empire, a complex mixture of imperial, national, regional and social loyalties. And this mixture of loyalties has often been hard for historians to resurrect or imagine, often hidden by the national mindset, or the nationalist mindset of later generations in a Central Europe of national states. But I think we need to imagine it if we are to understand how imperial loyalty moved in a national, regional direction as the war progressed. The war also, while it slowly made national tensions worse, was a time when many citizens first encountered many other nationalities from across the empire. This was either because refugees came into their home region, and you know about this a lot here in Slovenia, or because they themselves, the people themselves, moved as soldiers or as refugees. So the 4 years of war became an experiment in a true multinational Habsburg mission. It failed, of course, as we know, but to understand that failure we must explore the hopes and expectations that were there at the start of the war. It was, of course, above all the military authorities who tried to push forward the multinational fusion and to minimise any national or regional differences. Because this led to major population movement, major demographic movement, we cannot focus on one region or nationality in isolation when discussing the empire at war. And I'm going to try to range quite widely in looking at the empire as a whole, because that is how many individuals, perhaps most individuals, actually experienced the war. It was a war of movement and getting to know other peoples. So in just thinking about the spirit of 1914, several questions immediately emerge. How did this spirit show itself? How can historians really measure it through the sources available? To what extent was the enthusiasm directed and managed by the authorities, or was it spontaneous from below? Finally, how long did this spirit last? For the authorities, certainly, it was crucial to try to extend and maintain the population's commitment to the war. How could they do this? So let's start by studying the spirit of 1914 in all its diversity. I apologise for my PowerPoint presentation because the letters have moved, but I hope you can still follow it. Can I? Not sure that's moving. So, on the 26th of July 1914, in Klagenfurt, Celovets, there appeared a special edition of the main German newspaper, Klagenfurter Zeitung. It announced triumphantly, "An enthusiasm for war has now broken out. The tension which for weeks has been lying on us like an oppressive nightmare has given way to a liberating sigh of relief." The newspaper noted that on the streets of Celovets in the afternoon there were many groups of people engaged in lively conversation. Everybody was interested and anxious about what would happen next. The next day, at 12 o'clock, a huge yellow hot air balloon named Steyerska was launched by the Corinthian Committee for creating an Austrian Air Force. The balloon quickly rose in a northwest direction. When it was over the city, the small team on board threw out a mass of leaflets onto the population below. These bore a clear message, and it said, "Austria-Hungary, the army of our beloved fatherland is being partially mobilized. You should fulfill your patriotic duty enthusiastically. Long live our Emperor and King." Thanks. It's very difficult, very notoriously difficult, to interpret this spirit of 1914, which suddenly seemed to dominate across the Habsburg Empire. As Manfred Rauchensteiner has noted, it had mass psychological traits, and perhaps we need to think about it as a history of emotions. I'm not a historian of emotions, but it's something we need to think about. What we can say is that, as in Germany, a myth of universal war enthusiasm quickly developed, and it was repeated in many political and military memoirs over the next few decades. But unlike Germany, the official Austro-Hungarian legend would be challenged after 1918 by a strong counter-myth in some of the Habsburg successor states. The counter-myth questioned how far there was really popular support for the war in the summer of 1914. It proposed, in line with interwar nationalist narratives, that among some nationalities there had been real reservation, if not hostility, towards the Habsburg War against Serbia and Russia. This was especially the case with the Czechs, of course, but if we look hard, we can find it among all other peoples of the Habsburg monarchy as well. There were always stereotypes of loyalty, but we as historians must try to deconstruct them. Certainly, in 1914, many individuals who were strongly loyal towards the empire were surprised at the patriotic displays as well as the smooth process of military mobilization. Some were convinced that there was public consensus for war. So one German-Austrian officer recalled in his memoirs a ubiquitous, giddy enthusiasm everywhere. All national hatred, he said, had disappeared, and the only opposition came from depressed hypochondriacs. One General Staff Officer, Edmund von Glaise-Horstenau, who we see here, also stopped being anxious about the war when he realised that the monarchy seemed so united. He identified the German, Austrian, Magyar and Croat peoples as the most positive in terms of their morale. I think he could have added the Slovenians. But the fact remained that even the Czechs, Czech reservists, who, in contrast to 1912, were being called up without difficulty. He wrote later, "With proud determination, the armies advanced in the south and the north against the enemy." Another witness, a German novelist from Moravia, Karl-Heinz Strobel, noted later both a horror and a fascination about the whole experience. Strobel's memoirs are really very interesting to read. He said it was like the eruption of a volcano. What an amazing, colossal feeling it was to be part of this flare-up of millions of souls, to be carried away with the red-hot lava of this crater, filled with holy anger, indignation, and good conscience. So the English is quite difficult, but he's basically saying this is like a volcano. But it was young men who were perhaps most enthusiastic about mobilising their fellow citizens. Many had been practising for such an adventure at school and outside school in the years before 1914. And the last years of peace had seen an increase in youth groups across the empire, socialist, nationalist or religious. Most of these young men had an idealistic mission, and their adult mentors were encouraging them to mix healthy outdoor sports with a more serious goal of transforming society. For example, Austrian socialist leaders tried to keep a tight control on the minds of working-class boys. New Catholic or nationalist groups shared a common aim. They were fighting for either Catholic or nationalist rebirth in order to resist the increasing dangers of modernity in the 20th century. And I want just briefly to say something about these youth groups because it's something I've worked on for a long time and it's really the subject of my book a few years ago. I want particularly to just look at the case of the German Van der Vogel in Bohemia as just one small example of this phenomenon. The Bohemian Van der Vogel, being created in 1911, it tried, as in Germany, to reassert true, healthy German virtues or values in a society corrupted by bourgeois culture. But in Bohemia, in the context of the tight Czech-German national conflict, the hundreds of Van der Vogel boys were also told that their mission had a major national element, a major national ingredient. It was about confronting and attacking the Czech enemy. Karl Metzner, a leading Van der Vogel teacher, said in June 1913, "In Bohemia there was a high-ranking general who commanded all Van der Vogel battalions. They could be mobilised when he ordered it." So there was a militant mentality here which had an impact on many male teenagers. They saw the war adventure of 1914 as a new stage in their national mission. It was a struggle out of which a national rebirth would surely emerge. And I'm sure this is the same in cases in Slovenia. One youth leader, for example, said in July 1914, "From this young generation a new nation will arise. For our descendants it will be better when this purifying stream has rushed through society." Another youth leader wrote like this, "I curse the war because it brings discord into my calm, beautiful world. But I must bless it as the cleansing storm which may launch a fresher era." So war would wash away the dirt and the rubbish of the old world. The imagery here was of water, of cleansing, purifying water, but it needed action to achieve the final goal. Many public figures in different parts of the empire shared this sense of opportunity, this chance to complete a special national mission. And when mobilization was announced, they spontaneously justified the final Habsburg struggle against Russia and Serbia and volunteered to work for the new imperial mission. For example, the Austria-Hungarian episcopacy made a united stand, even if it was slightly different, to suit national congregations. Archbishop Czernok of Hungary preached that the aims of the war were sacred and just. Bishop Anton Jeglic, as you know, of Ljubljana, preached that the struggle threaded together God, Austria and the Slovene people in a common cause. The welfare of Slovenians was tightly linked to the Church and the Empire. The literary world of Vienna and Budapest also declared their imperial patriotism, but of course there were exceptions, people like Karl Kraus, Arthur Schnitzler, Endre Odi in Budapest. In Budapest, it was not only traditional writers who felt that national existence and civilization was at stake. Enthusiastic too were radical writers gathered around the modernist journal New God, which we see here. Miksha Fenyan, for example, wrote, "I sense my Hungarian identity with unexpected intensity." And if we just look at Vienna, and the cultural world of Vienna, most notorious was the behaviour of Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who felt this was a historic moment for revitalising the Austrian mission. Hofmannsthal served only briefly at the front, but he threw himself into public service at the War Ministry. He organised charitable support for soldiers and their families. This was all much to the disgust of the satirist Karl Kraus, who we see here on the left, who despised anyone who praised violence and war from the comfort of their armchairs. But Hofmannsthal continued to proclaim Austria's historic mission in his patriotic writings and celebrated the monarchy in his wartime lecture tours. Elsewhere in the Austrian university world, and I'm afraid I don't know what happened in the Slovenian university world, but it would be interesting to hear. In the Austrian university world in Vienna, there were similar hopes that an Austrian rebirth would occur, closely linked to some German renewal. So, one Austrian Catholic historian, typically, welcomed the war because he said it would give birth to a new greater Austria, which would satisfy all its peoples. It's not clear what this would mean, but there were a lot of these statements about a greater Austrian rebirth. But I think for most of the people living in the empire's towns and cities, it was surely the behaviour in the streets, the choreography in the streets, which had the greatest impact on the public mood. And we can partly see this from the way it was reported in newspapers, particularly in local newspapers. To some extent, but only to some extent, I think this was organised by the authorities. Much of it was spontaneous. The cities of Prague, Zagreb and Celovec were typical. In late July 1914, Prague's mayor, Karol Grosz, publicly assured the governor of Bohemia that Prague's population was loyal towards Emperor Franz Joseph. A few weeks later, on the emperor's 84th birthday, the city was covered in imperial and provincial flags. Shop windows displayed busts of the monarch. And Grosz, after attending a mass in the Tin Church on Staromecko Namiesti, made another declaration of public loyalty. In Zagreb, it was exactly the same. You have a picture there in the middle, which is from, it's not a very good picture, but it's from one of the key Zagreb newspapers showing Zagreb on the emperor's birthday. At this time, the whole city was lit up with lights. About 50,000 people took to the streets of Zagreb with lamps, so that the city, the newspaper said, was truly swimming in a sea of light. The newspaper reported the crowd shouted for their king and condemned the Serbs as murderers. Enthusiasm for the old ruler was indescribable, the newspaper said, but also for the war which he has declared on the enemy. In Celovec, meanwhile, the Landespräsident Alfred von Frieskene, who is, I'm afraid this is the only picture I could find, I'm sure there may be other pictures of him, but Alfred von Frieskene had regularly appeared before the street crowd since July, responding to their enthusiasm. He was applauded strongly when he told one large crowd, "Since the creation of the Habsburg Alpine state, our Carinthia has been a solid bulwark against every enemy. Her sons stand faithful and constant towards emperor and empire. Proud and firm like Carinthia's mountains are the sons of her inhabitants, fearless and brave." On the 5th of August, at a meeting of Celovec City Council, the mayor recalled how the people clearly sympathised with the House of Habsburg in the face of Serbian-Russian provocation. He proposed a council resolution declaring that Celovec was totally loyal to the dynasty, and the motion was carried unanimously. Now, as these press reports imply, the urban crowds in the first weeks of mobilisation significantly contributed to the spirit of 1914 across the empire. They suggest a public spontaneity from below, which the authorities then tried to control and organise. The historian Jeffrey Verhey, who's written a book about the spirit of 1914 in Germany, has noted this very strongly, but he only uses press reports, and he actually says in that book that I'm going to use newspaper reports only, so I think that limits his study. But what he shows, I think, is true to some extent, perhaps to a large extent, across the Habsburg Empire. The crowds across the Habsburg Empire were often active. They were not just bystanders. They performed certain rituals which formed a tradition which was always seen on patriotic occasions. The crowd's character also changed steadily during the first 6 weeks of hostility. Some of the crowds were curious, some were excited, some were celebrating, some were despairing. We should be careful, of course, not to generalise from such behaviour, especially when it's reported in the press, but it is still one indicator of morale at the start of the war, and it's important, I think, particularly because of the impact it had on the authorities, as well as the impact on less active citizens, on the bystanders. In Prague, for example, the curious crowd was often to be seen as war was declared. Hundreds gathered outside the press offices on Václavské náměstí. They moved between different newspaper offices, waiting for the latest special newspaper editions. These are actually pictures from Berlin, but they're really just to make my point about asking what is the nature of these crowds. In Celovec, a more traditional patriotic ritual took place among very loyal citizens. It was linked closely to preparations for military enlistment. The Klagenfurter Zeitung reported that the patriotic displays in the streets were fully inclusive and spontaneous. There were thousands of people of every age and gender, and of the most diverse nationalities. We can't say how far this was true. In fact, the crowds on the 30th of July in Celovec seemed to follow a very special route through the city. I don't know Klagenfurt, Celovec at all, but you'll have to follow me. This crowd followed a military parade that was celebrating mobilisation. On this tour, they stopped outside the house of the local military commander, then they went to the house of Frieskene and his wife, and then they finished on the square in front of a statue of Empress Maria Theresia. Here, the three national anthems of the Triple Alliance were played, and it was expected, of course, that Italy would still be an ally. Now, only occasionally did this facade of street loyalty slip, only occasionally, showing that not everyone was obedient. There were some despairing crowds. For example, those who, despite government promises, feared that the war would damage their savings. It takes a long time to find these despairing crowds, but I think we can find them. And here is one example, this cartoon in the middle, which is from a Hungarian satirical magazine from early 1914, and it shows us an angry crowd outside a bank. The cartoon is actually called The First Siege, and it says, the first siege of the war will not be against Belgrade, it will be against the bank. And we have the angry crowd there. But this negative picture was really very unusual. Most newspapers had a consensus behind the Habsburg mission. In the streets of Reichenberg, Liberec in North Bohemia, the local newspaper talked again about spontaneous enthusiasm and said, there will be no peaceful outcome. Now it is arms which will decide. So according to the press, which was of course the main medium for spreading information around the empire, the story was the same. Thousands of hearts were beating as one, all men were ready to enlist, all women were ready to coordinate their efforts on the home front with charitable work. So with all this, I think the authorities could feel very satisfied. In Hungary, even the socialist newspaper, Népszava, decided to fall in line and postpone any criticism. The Prime Minister in Hungary, István Tisza, felt his political enemies had now become polite, boring little boys. And, sorry, and we see this on this slide here. The fact is that there was a consensus essentially in Hungary, a superficial consensus until about 1916. But we can see an example of the political consensus in this cartoon on the right, which is again from the satirical newspaper, which says, what will St. Nicholas bring Hungary in December 1916? We have Tisza there as St. Nicholas with his gifts, and he has all the Hungarian politicians around him who seem to be behind him. But I would say it is a different situation in Austria with the Prime Minister, Count Sturck, who we see here. He was essentially, had said at the start of the war that this must be simply a war where we stress the need for enthusiasm for the war and we repress all opposition. And this was essentially the case. The position put forward by the authorities to the regional authorities after that. But I want to turn and I want to look at the position of the soldiers as well. If we look at the position of soldiers, we get quite an interesting example of a different side of a different view of the war as the war progressed. And we might think here, for example, about, I'll just take one example from Tyrol, where there was a variety of emotions, and there we find that some of the, on the whole, the evidence we have often splits into old and young, and with older people suggesting caution, and younger individuals being very enthusiastic. There's a good example, for example, an officer, a Viennese soldier from Vienna, Wilhelm Müller, who said that he was very enthusiastic about going to war, but that his mother was very pessimistic and said that nothing good would come of this war. But we have to look very hard to get these small examples of the different emotions. In the Tyrol, I'll give you one or two examples of this. There were examples of trains leaving from the front, of course, decorated and celebrating. One Tyrol farmer wrote in his diary, "The train was decorated with flowers, leaves and flags, but our thoughts were serious. Death seemed to be not far away. The songs were sad, sad like birds on the snow." As the train travelled west across the empire and into Galicia, they were met at every station by women who cheered the soldiers with flowers, wine and cigarettes. But the men were always uncertain here about their destination and about how long they would be away from home. For Wilhelm Müller, this soldier from Vienna, the shock really came at the end of August in Hungary, when he met his first train of wounded soldiers. He heard terrible tales about the retreat before Russian forces. And he said, he wrote, "After our train departed, we felt a total change of mood in the carriage. Everybody sat silently in his place and thought about a victorious end to the war." In Galicia, Müller noted that in contrast to Hungary, there was no celebration at the railway station. Instead, they found a landscape of miserable cottages and a poor, ragged people. But I think for most soldiers and officers, the real change in mood came after they entered the war zone. And here I would mention the memoirs of the Austrian officer Konstantin Schneider, which were published in 2003 and which are a wonderful read. They're really wonderful for the Eastern Front, but they're marvellous for the Socha Front as well. They're a wonderful description of the horror at the front. Konstantin Schneider vividly describes how events speeded up on the Eastern Front after a very slow 100-mile march to the front, how the excitement of war was then shattered by mass death in the first fights against Russian forces. The hopes of many men changed into fear as they entered the danger zone near the front, and then horror and panic as they tried to survive in what he called the death zone in the front line. The spirit of 1914, which for many meant a quick adventure alongside other young men, became a struggle for existence as the Russian machine advanced. Many men had felt a sense of history at work, sweeping them forward, but now it seemed to be working against them, forcing them into a personal struggle for survival. So by September then, the army had already lost its early euphoria. The old officer corps, as you know, had been decimated. A new life began of men struggling together to make sense of defeat and death. And I emphasise here there's a kind of emphasis in our sources about a new life beginning for many of these men. And certainly there were others who only went to war in 1918, but they too felt there was a kind of new life starting for them when they went to the front. And I would ask, just to think about it, surely for many of these men, the deaths of their friends, the deaths of their comrades made them then more obedient within the army to continue the war. Because otherwise, how do we explain the degree of obedience after late 1914? When then did this euphoria end on the home front? In late August, when the Landsturm soldiers departed for the front, there were again celebrations in many towns and signs of optimism. But already in September, the lists of the dead and missing began to multiply in the newspapers. They were soon 18 columns long in the Klagenfurter Zeitung. And if you look at Slovenets for this period, actually the lists of the dead and the wounded only appears in November. So there's a gap here between expectation and reality. The expectation of the war, the reality of what the war is, and it comes at different speeds across the hinterland. I just say that because if you just look at these two newspapers, you would find that the list of wounded in Slovenets is a month later from the list in Klagenfurter Zeitung. Some people perhaps were only less enthusiastic when they learnt about the failure of the army to take Belgrade in December, or about the horror of the Carpathian campaign, which we see on the right here. But some individuals, some civilians with men at the front, would have to remain stoical and calm. They had to stay committed to the war for the sake of their loved one. Other people, of course, have been sceptical about this war from the start. It was from September that this wider disloyalty became clear to the authorities, and they began to react. And I'm particularly interested in my research on this wider disloyalty. I was saying to Petra, I'm really researching the history of treason in the late Habsburg Empire, so I'm very interested in treason trials and how the authorities used treason, the charge of treason, the crime of treason, as a way to deal with South Slav traitors or Ruthenian traitors, etc. From September, I think this wider disloyalty became clear to the authorities and they began to react. As the early enthusiasm died away, the military expected, they wanted new patriotic displays, but they found different degrees of loyalty. For example, German politicians in Bohemia and Moravia openly supported the war, but most Czech leaders hesitated, they were ambivalent. On the 4th of August, Karol Kramář, the Czech leader, in a Czech newspaper, had already failed to mention the Habsburgs when he wrote about what would happen to the Czechs after the war. The implication of this was obvious. Czech leaders expected some reward, some imperial reform, as the price for supporting the Habsburg war. But there was not one simple Czech stereotype. There was not one stereotype of Czech scepticism, as national writers later pretended. In these early months, and perhaps later, we always find some signs of Czech Habsburg patriotism. The problem was that the military did suspect the Czechs of disloyalty because of their leader's silence. Silence is taken to be treason, really, because of their silence and because of signs of Czech insubordination at the front. In September, for example, the politician Václav Kováč, who actually certainly was a traitor, really, was suddenly arrested without charge and he was locked up for 3 years. It was one sign that the authorities felt the war was already entering a new phase. Security had to be tightened at the front, removing potential traitors and strictly controlling the flow of information around the empire. So I'm just going to say a few words in conclusion. And I was trying to think about what was the impact of the spirit of 1914, which is very hard to grasp, but I was just trying to think about what was the impact of this sudden enthusiasm at the start of the war. In September 1914, the radical Czech newspaper Čas warned, "This war will last a long time and we are only at the beginning." Now this might sound rather boring sentence, but when you read Čas, that's quite a significant thing to say, because there was censorship in the press, you have to read between the lines. So there was the suggestion here already that the Czechs have to wait and be prepared and that there will be some benefit for them at the end of this war. The Habsburg authorities, the Habsburg regime, had of course launched a war in July, and at the start they found a lot of support, they thought, for the fight against Serbia-Russia. But in this short first period, then, many hopes were raised which would never be fulfilled. For many soldiers, the hope was a quick victory, and instead they became part of a huge military machine which they could not escape except through death or capture. Most of these men were caught up in the war's momentum. There was death all around them, which made them, I would suggest, continue, because their friends had already died. But this momentum also included people like Konrad von Hertzendorf, effectively the head of the army, who was, of course, fatalistic. His confidence, too, was shattered early on when his son Herbert was killed, but he felt only victory could save the empire, and only victory would allow him to marry his beloved Gina, the woman he was waiting to marry. So I would suggest to you that early mass death pushed this army forward. But civilians too, after this early enthusiasm, still began to expect benefits as the war continued. The spirit of 1914 had exaggerated what could be achieved quickly. By 1915, the mood was changing, and hidden hopes, hidden aspirations from peacetime began to emerge. These hopes, social or national or economic, were often contradictory, but some had been there at the start of the war, and they were hidden under this show of Habsburg patriotism. And lastly, for the Habsburg regime, a major task was going to be how to prolong the early patriotism. They would turn to new methods of propaganda, exhibitions, films, campaigns for war bonds or for war charities. And we see some of them here. This picture at the top, Nasz Kral Franz Josef Kotrajenika. This is a very unusual picture because I think Franz Josef only went to hospital once. So this is a very early example of propaganda on behalf of the regime. I haven't found examples afterwards, but you might find that different. The picture at the bottom is a Hungarian film called The King is Praying. But the regime is going to have to learn new techniques, new propaganda to influence the population. But it all depended on winning the war. So August 1914 showed the authorities what unity could be like, but it was always an illusion. And as I've tried to show you, underneath this optimistic facade, there were many anxieties. The first optimism about a Habsburg war disappeared with the summer of 1914. In its place, there slowly came new hopes to match the mass death and sacrifice. And the longer the war continued, the more pressure was placed on the Habsburg regime to deliver some results and to show that the sacrifice actually had been worthwhile. Thank you very much.